The model of an American slave breeding farm. Rape for profit just as the founders intended, written by William Spivey or Spivey, published on March 2nd, I presume 2022. There are historians that will tell you that while there were occasional slave breeding by individual plantation owners, there was no such thing as a breeding farm. They say economically it would not be feasible to have a farm of slave women who did nothing but breed, producing no revenue for years at a time while requiring food, clothing, and health care. The average breeding farm didn't follow that model unless it was supplemented by another source of revenue, like a slave jail, which gave access to the men, often the very bucks they were looking for to produce bigger, stronger slaves. The price a slave child could generate was partially based on height and frame. Men and women breeders were selected for their physical qualities over any other factor. I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital while his labors disappear in mere consumption. By Thomas Jefferson. On the normal slave breeding farm, slave breeding was like a secondary line of business, though it may have produced the most revenue. Slaves, including the women, continued to pick cotton or grow and harvest rice and sugar. Sometimes the men were leased out to the railroads, often performing the dangerous work of blasting tunnels. Others built the nation's prestigious educational institutions, Harvard, Brown, Georgetown, and Jefferson's University of Virginia. Some colleges only benefited from the profits of slave traders and owners. Others owned slaves themselves. Women often worked in the fields until late in their pregnancy. This may have been a factor in the high mortality rate of both mothers and children. It was factored in as a cost of business. Overall, the numbers of domestic slaves continually rose, referred to as natural increase, as if the result of sex-starved slaves. In reality, slaves were often forced to marry other slaves selected by the master based on physical traits, or forced to breed with the hardiest men, or raped by the master and his friends and family. Even the light-skinned slaves resulting from these pairings had special value as house servants, or some of the women became fancies to serve as bed wenches at the master's discretion or used as prostitutes. The purposeful breeding of slaves in America was no accident. The foundation of the process was part of the Constitution of the United States, required changes in law and laws passed by Congress. All of it ties to the history of tobacco and its impact on Virginia farmers, including the previously quoted Thomas Jefferson, who led much of the charge. By the time of the Revolutionary War, tobacco was already diminishing as a cash crop in Virginia and nearby states. Failure to rotate crops and unstable exports due to wars involving Britain, their best customer, led to many farmers switching crops. At one time, tobacco was the leading crop in Virginia, requiring a large number of slaves to support it. By the late 1700s, slavery was Virginia's biggest export, with tobacco lagging far behind. New slaves in America came from two sources. They were born to other slaves already present, or they arrived by ship from Africa or the Caribbean. Homegrown slaves were competing against the lower-priced slaves from the international market. Though the framers never explicitly mentioned slavery until the 13th Amendment, the Constitution established the framework which would make slave breeding more profitable. Virginians played a significant role in the shaping of the Constitution, coming up with the Virginia Plan, which was the document from which negotiations began. This, I believe, is a copy of the Virginia Plan shown on the screen. Attributed mostly to James Madison and then Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph, it set forth 15 resolutions, many of which became the basis for the Constitution. Smaller states rallied behind the New Jersey Plan, which addressed their concerns. For the purpose of slave breeding, it was South Carolina, home of the nation's largest port receiving slaves, Charleston, that impacted the Constitution. In a bargain with the Virginians, it was agreed that the United States would maintain the international slave trade for a minimum of 20 years from the ratification of the Constitution. The results of that negotiation expressed itself in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. The Constitution set the stage, but there was still a specific action required to eliminate the competition of international slavery. Congress had to pass a law banning the international slave trade, which it could not do according to the Constitution, prior to January 1st, 1808. The president at that time, Virginia slaveholder Thomas Jefferson, wasted no time in ensuring that slaveholders in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and a few other states could maximize their profits by eliminating the competition. He got all of the legislation out of the way in 1807 so that the ban of the international slave trade could take effect on the first day possible. He couched it in the language of the ending of the violation of human rights of slaves, but the new law did nothing to end slavery. It only offered protectionism against foreign imports, enriching those who grew their own. Yeah, so I'm going to make a comment here very quickly. A lot of people say sometimes that the founding fathers of the United States wrestled with slavery, or they eventually wanted slavery to be phased out, but this is absolutely not the case. It doesn't make sense. If that was the case, why wouldn't the original founding fathers give up their own slaves? Why didn't they also write it into the Constitution, hey, don't have slaves? And the ban on importing slaves, one, was just to protect their markets, right? But was just to protect their slaves that they already had now. Because if they kept importing new slaves, Haiti would have happened in America, right? And they wouldn't have wanted that, okay? I'll continue reading. I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, and which the morality, the reputation, and the best interest of our country have long been eager to proscribe. Thomas Jefferson, while he raped a young girl named Sally Hemings, a young black woman, and made her have his children. This man was sick. Fuck Thomas Jefferson. I don't give a fuck. There was one thing that made slave breeding possible. In most of the rest of the world where slavery existed, the children of slaves were born free. According to English common law, which previously was the standard for the American colonies, the bloodline of children followed the father. This made fathers financially responsible for their children, and they could be forced to provide at least nominal support for their illegitimate offspring. As early as 1662, that was changed in America, which adopted a new standard where children followed the mother's bloodline. Any child of a slave woman was automatically a slave as well. Any plantation owners or their sons, or any white man who raped a slave and created a child, had no respectability but ironically accumulated wealth as a result. Slaves were used as collateral on loans and treated like any other asset. These laws, known as partus sequitur ventrum, legalized rape and perpetuated slavery. They were a peculiarly American institution. Once again, white supremacy shows that it has no regard for any standards or morals or anything like that. English common law, which a lot of Americans like to say is the basis of our Constitution, really doesn't hold any weight when it's time to enact some whiteness and some white supremacy. When it's time to actually make money, dehumanize other people, English common law goes into the trash, and what we want to do as, white men, that's what gets done, right? That's horrible. That's really horrible. I'll continue reading. In American history books and descriptions of slavery, you can find references to breeders, but find little information as to their actual lifestyle. If they were paired with a mate and didn't produce a child within a reasonable period, they might be given a new mate, hoping for better success. They were still available to the master to use as a concubine at will. Masters often had to approve a marriage, wishing to make sure the likely product of that mating would be a strong child. For those plantations more attuned to the business of selling slaves to optimize profits, they typically sold the children when they were between 8 and 10 and able to perform a daily workload. This was especially true in Virginia and Maryland, whose plantations had less need for slaves to work their own fields due to diminishing returns from tobacco. The slaves were sold further south, sent by ship, by rail, or walking in coffles with slaves chained in pairs and then linked in long lines to their destination. Slave breeding wasn't merely anecdotal or rumored. It was systemic and played a great role in how America was literally built and how it got its wealth, by paying less for labor than other nations, ensuring a more profitable outcome. Several opinion articles have appeared in leading publications like the Wall Street Journal and National Review in defense of the founders and their aspirations to end slavery as soon as possible. The truth that applies to most of them is that they were slave owners themselves, didn't free their slaves during their lifetime, some not even after their deaths, and put in place the mechanism which perpetuated one of the most heinous acts in American history, the forced breeding of slaves for profit. While there were almost no farms that exclusively bred slaves, almost all major plantations engaged in slave breeding, some using slaves to balance their ledgers at the end of the year by selling off the amount needed to pay their taxes or settle debts. Some historians would tell you that slave breeding plantations didn't exist. They would say that the practice was rare and that it was against the principles of America and its founders. They might admit it might have occurred sporadically, but that such an institution could not take place in a great country such as our, founded on high morals and principles. In each of those cases, they would be wrong. Once again, we will never forget our ancestors. We'll never forget the tragedy of our existence. We also have to see the parallel, the linear line drawn from our time during slavery and the sexualized viciousness that we lived under, the sexual brutality that our women endured, and draw that parallel today to how our women are viewed and also how us men, black men, are viewed. Dehumanizing somebody through their sexuality is one of the oldest tricks in the book. And I made a video a few weeks ago about fetishizing black men's genitalia. And I forgot to mention this, but I think as black men, we should not be embracing the BBC myth or idea. It's not helpful to us. And we should never forget our ancestors and what we went through. And I'll end with that. I hope this information was helpful. My name is Simon Hill, and peace.